Okay, welcome. It's 11 a.m. sharp in Brisbane, 12 p.m. New South Wales, Victoria, and 9 a.m. in Perth, where a lot of our attendees are coming in from today. We'll just give a couple of minutes while people enter in. People are starting to stream in. We welcome everybody today. Although we can't see you, it's great to have you part of the webinar. So I'm just keeping an eye on numbers as they continue to grow before kicking off formally. And most of us are quite Zoom fit these days. So just keeping in mind, we've got the chat panel for you to feel welcome to raise questions on, or the Q&A. We'll be keeping an eye on that one throughout the day or throughout the session. And we'll also be keeping a keen eye on the discussion points so that we're capturing the key insights to share after the session as well. Okay. So there's a few more people logging in just now as well. I feel like I needed a couple of jokes to warm up our panel today. Okay, so we're still just waiting for a few more people to join us. Today's been our sort of strongest in attendee numbers, which we're pretty happy to see. And a warm welcome to everyone. And what you can do is also, if you want to see all the panelists at once, in the top right corner, hit the gallery view or just the speaker view to stick on one. Again, for people just joining us now, encourage you to be having the Q&A panel open or the chat panel so that you can ask questions. I'd encourage it to be myself directly if it's on the chat, or everyone to be able to see. That way I can sort of make sure that I'm asking the questions as people have a natural pause, you know, or pop it into the questions that we have throughout the webinar. So that as people continue to join us, I might start to kick into a bit more of a formal introduction so that we can kick on, and appreciate everybody's time today. So a really warm welcome from myself, Blake Redding of Mapien, Associate Director, Organisational Psychologist, and leading the team in Culture and Leadership. Today is our third instalment of our wellness webinar, and really continues on that vision to be trying to provide, I guess, insights and information from a diverse panel that are really designed to help our HR leaders, HR business partners, senior leaders and business owners to be recognising opportunities to be making decisions and advising strategies that are really going to strengthen the wellness of our businesses in the short term, medium term and long term. Where today we sort of put this topic together about 2 months ago, because we were starting to have conversations with our clients around how do we start to see mental health part of the leadership toolkit. We're seeing lots of shifts and changes in how leadership development is being rolled out, and that expectation that not just how am I leading people with a hybrid workforce or working from home workforce, but then also that mental health component, how we're seeing that to be front and center as part of that leadership capability. So that's really the vision for today's session. And again, with the types of conversations that we're having, we've started to roll out some interventions. We're advising at that strategic level. And one of the key findings that we're sort of experiencing is that, you know, through the COVID impact, we're finding a lot of teams unifying, but it is that collaboration that creates the opportunity for the stronger and more sustainable outcomes to be happening. And that's part of the thinking behind why we've got quite a diverse panel today. So we welcome back Connor Fahey from Perth, Principal Consultant, and really providing that advisory insights from an industrial relations perspective, strategic HR perspective. Lisa Payton, psychologist and Associate Director in our Culture and Leadership team, really providing that practical and scientific insight from a psychological perspective in the workplace. And a warm welcome to Dr. Carlo Bellini, who joins us from Perth today. We're quite excited to have you on the panel as founder and director of Health Innovation Performance, or HIP Consulting. And I guess one of the areas that really caught our attention in how innovative you are at the moment in terms of founder and CEO of the Virtual Chief Medical Officer. So VCMO, providing tremendous, I guess, innovative and medical advice for organisations and the like through these tough times. So it's great to have such a diverse panel for us today. And just as a disclaimer, because we do have some legal representation on the panel today, is that to sort of look at the advice we provide today, not as specific technical legal advice. If there are any particular issues that do arise for yourself in the workplace, we do advise you to seek independent legal advice. So that's one of the disclaimers that's important for me to share with you today. So I guess one of the words I used, repetitively to kick off the session and throughout the webinars is mental health. And so much like culture, and it's easy for the word to be misused. So I'm interested to hear from Carlo initially to, warm welcome, and hear from yourself, I guess, from your perspective, when we're using the word mental health so much at the moment, getting on that same page in terms of what is, mental health will really help us kind of get on that same page. So how do you define mental health, Carlo?
Thanks so much, Blake. The first part that I think is really important to acknowledge in this is that mental health is a category. It's a really big category. And in a similar way to physical health, if we thought of physical health as a category, they have a variety of different components. But we have a large difference often in our response. If someone says, I've got physical health challenges, often it's met with more compassion, or, how are you? What's wrong? If someone says I've got mental health challenges, there's often a bit more of a, apprehension and the like. And I want you to all consider, and I think the most useful practical way of thinking about it is that mental health is part of the human condition. Anxiety, sadness, happiness, stress, that's actually all part of the human condition. But it's on a continuum and it's on a spectrum. So you can have very appropriate stress, you can have very appropriate sadness, and it's when that becomes quite significant that we have mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, psychosis, addiction, and they become significant disorders that actually require management. Now, they also have appropriate clinical diagnoses and criteria to meet. But yet, when we use the term mental health, we seem to encompass both of these quite often together. Now, it's quite normal in a pandemic for people to feel stressed, for people to feel worried, people to feel anxious. Those are normal human responses to stress. And mental health, we should get more specific in the way we actually talk about it, is that having an appropriate response, or is there actually a mental health disorder that is present here?
So I guess the key take here, to help us be on that same page, we're talking about mental health as a response, to a disorder on that continuum. And I think if we have that in mind as we step through our webinar, what we really wanted to bring was some insights around the why, behind mental health being a business case. And although it might be commonsensical, I guess it's sharing some of the different viewpoints and situations that we're encountering to really help us put it onto, I guess, the radar as a top organizational priority. Because one of the threats of COVID being an invisible virus, you can't see it and it makes it more threatening. We also find it's the invisibility of mental health and also the stigma that can make it so much more difficult to put as a priority and act on it. So we want to kick off with the why and then unpack that into the how in terms of some of the tactics and strategies that the experts on the panel are undertaking with clients at the moment, and then unpack it a step further into the what around some specific, or sort of in speaking with the panel, thought about moments of truth. Some of these specific examples or situations that are anonymized to respect people involved, that provide some of those war stories that provide that insight into the risk and opportunities that might be there for us. And so I think with going into the webinar with that sense of mental health literacy, is tapping into both at the organizational and leadership level, I guess, that capacity to be initiating conversations and speaking to these matters. And it does feel like we pick on leaders quite a bit, particularly through this webinar, but it is because they're a critical workforce segment for change. And so I guess in terms of tapping into the why, I'm interested to Lisa to kick off a little bit with that sense of, I guess, some of the conversations and even research that you're, seeing hit the radar around why, what is making leadership such that hot topic and issue to be an absolute strategic priority right now?
I think the business case is definitely out there already for having to manage mental health in the workplace. You're talking, and I've seen a whole range of statistics around what it costs. The Australian economy, I think I've got one stat here, is like 14.81, and that's fairly conservative. $14.81 billion a year is costing the Australian economy. Now that's quite conservative for other numbers that I've seen. So in an organisation, people are taking, I think that some of the research is saying that 3.5, each individual takes 3.5 days off a year in regards to their mental health. So it's an exceptionally expensive way of, if we don't manage mental health well. So it's also when people, compared to physical injuries, people take more time out and take longer to return to the workplace when there's mental health issues. And people do not, when you look at some of the research there, 30% of people who actually did make claims for psychological compensation, only 30% compared to 75% physical got support. So 30% didn't feel, 30% felt the organisation took care of them, compared to when it's a physical injury, 75% people felt they took care of. People are scared. I'm going to be really blunt. People are nervous around mental health. People are scared of exacerbating existing mental health conditions. They are scared of, I don't know what to do. And I had this conversation just yesterday where someone said, my leaders are really good at identifying when someone's different, but they don't know what to do then. So I think there's a huge business case that we can get better at managing mental health in the workplace.
And I think, Rez, you mentioned fear being a key driver here, and I think this is where I'm actually interested too from, I guess, Connor and then Carlo too, where what are some of the key reasons you're seeing leaders to be so terrified about taking that step from, I'm noticing something different, but I'm terrified to say anything or go near it. Connor? Yeah.
I think some of this fear comes from a perception of complexity. If we look at the workplace legal interface or the industrial relations interface, mental health interfaces across three pieces of legislation: the occupational health and safety legislation, workers' compensation legislation, and then laws that provide disability discrimination protection. And under these laws, there's a variety of duties, rights, and obligations. For example, under occupational health and safety, generally an employer has a responsibility to provide and maintain a safe working environment to ensure that employees are not harmed because of work or exposure to hazards. And under this duty, harm includes mental harm, and hazards include psychosocial workplace hazards, which include things like bullying. And stemming from this OH&S duty, you have workers' compensation legislation, which might apply where an employee is mentally harmed because of their work. A workers' compensation claim flows through. And then disability discrimination interfaces, because the legislation in various forms applies to provide a workplace protection to an employee who has a mental illness, and under relevant disability discrimination, a mental illness is covered under the definition of disability. So it's understandable, given what I've just explained, that employers and managers feel like there is a number of limbs of risk that exist in and around the concept of mental health. And then, therefore, the management of these risks is perceived to be quite complex. And it's been my experience that given this perceived complexities, managers have sought to avoid addressing managing mental health issues. So for example, I've heard statements such as, the more I know, the more risk there is to the business, so I don't want to know, or I'm out of my depth here, there's way too much risk, I'm just going to ignore it and hope that it resolves at the individual level. Or if I performance manage this employee, I'll be accused of bullying, and that's got a big workers' compensation claim. And maybe more damaging is the other side of the coin, which is claims of mental health and bullying are just used as a tactic to avoid performance. And this is just a crying wolf scenario. And on that basis, the manager will bullishly ignore mental health issues. So look, from what I've explained, there is a perceived complexity of laws. And on this basis, I've seen mental health ignored or escalated through avenues that are perceived, more legal avenues that might actually be required, where they could have been more effectively managed in a managerial interface.
Right, and I think, you go, Lee.
I was just going to say, I hear exactly the same thing. It's like people are, I just don't want to go there. They're just pulling the mental health card. And I think we're not naive, and that we do say that some people will use the system, definitely, but there's processes in place to support a person. But let's actually, if we come from a place of actually, let's look at this as it is. I think I have one example. This is one of my favourite stories. I had one person I was coaching, and she said she was having problems with a staff member, and for the last 6 months, I can't quite remember now. And she said, I said, "Oh, have you had discussions with her?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm talking about her performance, etc." And then she said, "And she's been with me for 6 years." And I went, "Has she not performed for that whole 6 years?" And she said, No, just in the last 3 months. And I said, "Oh, well, did you just ask her if she was okay, if anything's gone wrong?" And she went, "What would I want to do that for?" And I just was like, you've had someone who was a fantastic person who attention detail spot on to somebody who's not. So we see it, but yet we're still fearful of going there. But I also see, if I flip that, I see people who are great leaders who want to do the right thing, but have other systemic issues come in, such as unions not allowing a person to go and get an assessment, an objective assessment. So I think there are some people out there who try really hard that can't get to support a person. There's people who just avoid it. So it's just such an interesting area. And I think one of the key messages is we have to manage it. We have to support people better.
And I hear from a sort of psychology viewpoint, it's the uncertainty that is making it, and the fear, that's preventing that sort of action, perhaps through the complexity of the legal side. It's complex. I'm not going to go there. And there's a little bit of the education versus motivation, where there could be frustration through past experience that it hasn't been managed well, so it never will be. So that's where we sort of get that cynicism in the mental health card. And I think, Carlo, through a medical lens, from your perspective, we're kind of digging into the pain point, I suppose. It's really bringing it where at an economy level of somewhere along those lines of 14 billion, Lisa, and in the workplace, I understand 6.1 billion, largely because that early intervention isn't implemented. From your perspective, Carlo, it's sort of a double-barreled one to take us into the next piece, which is that sense of where are you seeing, mental health to be, raising that level of strategic priority? How's it becoming more of a priority? And then what does the next best step look like?
I think it's becoming a priority, and we see this evolve over recent years, where I think the stigma of mental health is being acknowledged, and in sharing that and discussing it, it's seeking to be reduced. And there is this movement and this acknowledgement that actually, mental health, it affects all of our lives, and work is part of our lives. Building on what Connor and Lisa were saying before, I also just wanted to share that when we look at people, some people are much more comfortable talking about feelings and emotions than others. And I see that a lot in managers. So for example, in certain industries, say engineering, for example, you have more people that are thinkers rather than feelers. And in other industries, HR, nursing, some more healthcare, allied health, you have more feelers. And I think that industries also have different mental health literacy quite often because of the work that they do, and leaders, managers in that field being able to actually have that more direct discussion about feelings and often not feel scared about it. The point that I wanted to make with that is the other person is feeling what they feel, whether you talk about it or not. They're feeling what they feel, whether you talk about it or not. Now, as we move into what does it actually drive a focus on this in the workplace, in my opinion, it's leadership. And it's leadership, and that's the CEO, management team, or individual teams, and you can have leaders that don't necessarily have positional authority, but people recognizing that this is something important. And when I work with a lot of executives from very large companies, I find when I talk about health with them and I talk about, how well do you sleep? How's your diet? Those really traditional type of questions, often it's just met with sort of like, yeah, well, don't really mind about this. If you talk to them about their performance, what keeps them up at night, what stresses they've got, which are all parts of mental health in many ways, they get very, very engaged. And I think when you can get leaders to think about their own life, their own situation, their own challenges, their own stresses, and then consider that organizationally, and that everyone is just another sample of that, you can start increasing that literacy. And the first step is acknowledging that this is something important.
Brilliant. And so I think there's that, the acknowledgement, achieved, and I think in earlier, Carlo, too, would you sort of see that at levels of leadership in terms of whether you might be able to, where would you start, or would you pick those who might be more likely to start to acknowledge?
So my opinion with this is you always go to the top, because if you're trying to push something but your ultimate leader authority doesn't agree or the like, then some point down the road it's going to be not supported, discontinued. So always start at the top. But with that, I think it's important to get a group of people and have these discussions about, how are we going to address this in the business? You can ask the question, is this an important issue? What makes this an important issue? How is this relevant for our business? And I think a lot of the time people can try and discount mental health or health in general because it's very much like a ticker box. It's like a wellness program or the like, where people struggle to see the return on investment. And often that struggle exists is because it's much less tangible. You can measure certain outputs in productivity. It's very often hard to measure the impacts of different areas. But the work that I've done is that you really can. And when you start talking to business leaders from the top and the executive team and then throughout, you actually see how this can tangibly impact performance in whatever business you're actually operating.
Brilliant. And I guess one of that sort of takeaways, that sense of, similar to say engagement scores, when you're benchmarking, there can be that sense of, are we higher or lower? And it's about shifting that focus in terms of what's important for us, why is it relevant, and what are we doing to boost it? And there's some good lessons learned that you've sort of articulated there in terms of start from the top as much as we can, make it relevant to the business context, to start that conversation happening from the top, giving permission for it to reach that level. And I might ask for perhaps some examples a little bit when we get to a bit more detail about how you may have gone about getting some of the metrics and measurements behind the impact of mental health in context. And I think that's where I'm interested, I guess, Lisa, where, we were talking about some of the barriers for leaders in engaging these conversations through fear, and that sort of at that strategic level, how do we sort of start that conversation at the top to make it important, that we've got permission to speak about it. And then I think that next sort of level is, how are we, helping leaders become, more confident, to actually start to speak to mental health.
So I think that, if I could just piggyback off a little bit on what Carlo was just saying then, and then I can address that in more detail. So I think that starting at the top is absolutely critical, because what Carlo's essentially talking to is that systems approach. And so you start at the top so that you've got the executive team, senior leaders all vying and saying, yes, this is important for us. And when people want to bring mental health up in the workplace, 8 out of 10 people don't feel safe in doing that. They feel that that is going to be held against them in regards to their performance. So there's a number of levels there, and I do absolutely agree with Carlo that leadership is critical, and a lot of it is how do you make it psychologically safe for people to be talking about this. So it's critical that you do have that buy-in all the way through the organisation. Now, people, if we think about the practicality of that, 8 out of 10 people don't feel safe bringing it up, but where they do tend to go is through their peers. So they were very comfortable, usually talking to somebody in the workplace. So then when I think about interventions and how we support people and to give them this goes into what you were talking about, confidence to have it. We've got to educate ourselves. I was, when I started, because mental health, I'm an organization, I focus in organizational psychology. I don't do, I'm very clear on my boundaries around clinical psychs, and there's some fantastic people out there and medical doctors to take care of that. Yes, I've got an education around that, which makes it more comfortable, and I'm a feeler. As Carlo said, so I'm very comfortable talking about emotions. But we have to educate people. So if we think about people in the workplace are going and talking to their peers, then we need to be educating people on what they can do. Leaders are fearful they feel like they've got to become psychologists. And I said, no, you don't. You just got to be able to have a conversation with somebody and be able to guide them to the right area. And that's all I do. I hear what a person's, what they're experiencing. How can I support you? What do you need here? And it's those kind of really healthy conversations. So when you look at kind of interventions and getting the confidence, it's about education. And there's fantastic, gosh, you just go to Black Dog and, Beyond Blue. There's so many great resources out there in existence already to support people. Helping people, this is the really critical part for leadership at that frontline level, is the psychological safety. You've got to feel safe to bring it up and know that you're not going to be punished because you do. And the challenge is, if we go in with the mindset that they're pulling the mental health card, we've already stopped our thinking process to say, actually, maybe this person really does have a challenge, and how can I support them? And if we do that, you will get better engagement. There's lots of great research out there that supports really positive outcomes from that. Now, did I actually answer your question there, Blake?
Yeah, so I think we're in the groove, and I can start to see where there's going to be one for Connor probably in the third question, but I just want to dig in a little bit there to the advice that we're giving here in terms of that sense of, if we're probably on the webinar because we agree mental health is important. We need to strengthen the literacy. Yep. So we've got to get to the C-suite to articulate how important it is. Carlo mentioned, the best way to do it is to really initiate, or create the opportunities for open, honest conversations so people can feel it themselves to start to connect the dots. And I think, have you, Carlo, am I on the right track there? I think, is there anything in there that you've really found help get on, like as an intervention? Because I'm hearing that sense of, from Lisa, we've got to build acceptance that it's important and make it okay to talk about. So if I'm an HR leader or a senior leader, how might I bring it up with the C-suite?
So in terms of that, it first depends on your business, the leader, the relationship that you have with your business leader as well. So there's a variety of things that depends on the individual circumstance. The way that I would generally say to approach it is with the principle of authenticity. Now, what I see and what so many of us see in different companies, there's the corporate shiny brochure. There's the very, very much manicured emails about, it's so amazing to work here, but 25% of the workforce is being made redundant. And people know that when it's not genuine. People know that. And you can write whatever you want on your values and the 5 values that we've got. People judge behaviors. Behaviors are revealing, not what's written on paper. And I think in that principle, it's about having an authentic discussion with the leader and the senior leaders. And I often approach it like I shared before about, tell me about you and what goes through your mind in running this business. And you create that psychological safety. And I do this quite often. And as an external, I often get the ability to create that container of safety where you can actually go a bit deeper and you get beyond the veneer and you find out what's really ticking under the hood. And once you have those discussions there, then it's about, well, what's going on in our organization? And COVID, and I think that the mental health challenges and stresses around COVID, job security, performance, pay reductions, seeing our friends and the like, and the threat of lockdown and isolation, and specifically in Victoria, as we've seen. These are well-known things. Everyone's affected in some way. And it's about having those discussions with that authenticity, and that creates a shared vulnerability. And then it's from that point that we can go, okay, well, this is the leader's views on that. what's important for our organization? What do we need to acknowledge as our priorities? And strategies usually worked out, and this complement strategy, it's not against strategy. You do it aligned with that. And you go, well, how can we actually have some of these authentic discussions with our workforce and open up if we haven't already done that? And then I think it's reaching out. And I've seen some really, some companies do it in quite interesting ways where the leaders actually sharing some of their stories and sharing some of their challenges and what's gone through their mind and how they've actually gone on this journey. And it makes it much more human to human rather than someone that just sits in the C-suite and you know, is divorced from what's actually happening in the workforce. So as a principle, I think it's about authentic conversation, authentic discussion, and accessing shared vulnerability.
Sure. And so I think there's that, what sort of connects with me, and it came up in our last webinar too, was around leadership culture. As this is the way that our leaders are affecting the culture of the business. And so where that C-suite will be meeting regularly, often about operational matters or strategic items, you know, getting that spot, you know, in that meeting place to make it safe to talk about the effects of mental health on them. You know, whether if they're fact-based, get the facts to get in the door, create the space to speak about it. Then I heard, you know, get that right. There's almost a little bit there where we might have a wellness program already in place, tick, EAP, tick, you know, but culture's where it's at. You know, start from the top to get the conversation happening. Then probably revisit the wellness side where Lisa and Carla both mentioned about education. You know, education is tapping into that fear of not knowing what to do, you know, to try and alleviate that. What makes a brilliant education experience or program, you know, in this space? And I'd be interested, sort of, Lisa, and then there's probably some Lisa.
What makes a
brilliant education? Where you mentioned it's about education of our leaders, about, you know, how to have the conversation and start it. What makes a great education sort of program or experience?
For me, there's a lot of literature out there, and we talk about this quite a lot. And I had a speaking to a leader yesterday who said, we were talking about some interventions and what support we could provide, and she said, "Oh, well, Lisa, what's going to stop this from being, you know, a training course people attend and then they just put it in the bottom of the drawer and forget about it?" And I thought that was an excellent question. I really liked that question. And I said, because what we do is we make it experiential. We pull on you know, adult learning principles. And for example, one of the things that we do is we use actors, and we do scenario-based training. So when you're sitting in a training room, and I call it a cold state, no emotions, I'm listening, my rational brain goes, oh yeah, I know how to do that. Oh yeah, I know how to do that. Easy, walk out, till I'm faced with a really highly emotional state. And then all of a sudden, all that theory that's stored here is gone. And this part of the brain that I need to have good discussions. So it's the quality of the information that you're using has got to be good quality. So make sure your sources are good, but it's got to be a realistic experience for people. And I think that, you know, teaching, one of the things we do is teach people how to have conversations. And it is that, you know, you get more comfortable with it, the more you do it. So I think that's really critical. And I think if I swing back to people talk to their peers, the danger, and I know that you will never stop it. So where I see there's another level of support that's needed. People need boundaries, because what happens is people get over invested in someone's story and their experience and their compassion. And then sometimes they get caught up in that, and that's not necessarily healthy for them. And then you get these stories that go through organizations. So if we also need to educate our people on what to do. They're not counsellors, they don't have it. So there's actually like some first aid, mental health first aid, sorry. And so you can actually put people through that. And one of the things they say is, you know, you're not there to counsel. You're just a facilitator to help guide them into the area. So I think that's a really critical part of the kind of intervention for people as well.
I'll just quickly build on that very briefly. I think there's a couple of other parts. So as Lee said, there's so much information out there. I actually think it's much more, we live in a world of information overload. And training, what's really important is like, what's the bite-sized pieces of information that are relevant for me? And I think that's a really important part of the training, as well as what Lee said, the experiential side. Another version of the way that I do that and roll out mental health wellbeing training for supervisors across large businesses is facilitated discussions within that group, where you actually get people in real time sharing their feelings, how they feel, challenges that they've had, and you can do it in a really safe container. And you almost do it in pods across the business, where you bring supervisors together that actually we teach them the fundamentals of mental health, what's important, some of the first aid, but you do it in that interactive way. And people just starting and participating in that journey, they leave the room in quite a different frame of mind, where they're like, that made a difference and a shift for me. And it's by that experience that you actually can propagate it through the organization.
I think there's also a lot of coaching, which is a very similar space. And I've been coaching, I work with some fantastic leaders, and I was coaching a gentleman recently, and he'd undergone some mental health challenges, and sought help. And, so he was seeing his psychologist once a month. He was seeing his coach once a month. So, he had it really nicely stepped out. So he's doing it really well. So he identified early that he was, not as early as I would have liked, but he identified early, he got the help. But then what he did, and I do like it, is because he's a male, I'm sorry, because there's that macho culture at times, particularly in the industry he works in. And he talked about it with his whole team, which made it safe for the team to then come forward. He then went somewhere else, and a team member then approached him about it because she'd heard how the struggles he was having. So you can see that really nice ripple effect. So for me, and I do think it's right, you're right with the overload of information, but knowing your sources, and I think that's probably, I'm a bit lucky, is I can tell really good research. That's one thing we can do. And so, I look at Black Dog and, Beyond Blue and those places, WorkSafe Australia, there's some fantastic resources out there. So, and not to overwhelm, you're right.
Yeah. So I'm sort of hearing this sort of sense of, we want to shift the dial from a possible sort of experience of fear, uncertainty, and an expensive sort of way that we're responding to mental health, to one where people are, comfortable, to speak about it, more confident in starting the conversation. That education side is about probably investing more time in that storytelling, and making it okay to speak, and opening up, I suppose, people's minds to, I guess, some of the more technical sides that might relate to boundaries and what the do's and the don'ts, or for lack of a better term. And I think that's where, I guess, Connor, from a legal perspective, and it's probably been a journey, that I know I've shared with a couple of IR consultants in Mapien over the years, in terms of how do we build in that, the mandatory compliance, where Carla mentioned there might be some bite-size, intel that we really must have. Where have you seen that done well?
It's interesting. Lisa mentioned sitting back and listening and thinking, but then actually being in the face of it, and it being disjointed from what you thought Look, I think it's important to note that within the area of mental health and workplace, that there are a number of complex laws that I've articulated that do interface in and around mental health. However, and that complexity, as I said before, generates a bit of a sense of being overwhelmed and maybe some avoidance. But it's been my experience that when leaders and managers actually understand the underlying rights, obligations, and protections, then the perceived complexity of the risks of managing a mental health issue fall away. So a manager that might actually understand what the legal, technical, industrial risks are and where they might lead to will generally have greater confidence in appropriate management of the employee's mental health issue at the time. And in terms of learning, it's preferable, however, that a manager doesn't learn the underlying rights, obligations, and protections not through the experience of being dragged through a workers' compensation claim, or the experience of being dragged through a discrimination claim. By way of business risk, you want to avoid those or mitigate those risks. So this is where there's probably more of a need for a detailed overview interface of the relevant underlying rights, obligations, and protections, and training at that manager level about what they are and how to mitigate those. And in this space, Mapien and myself on a number of occasions have engaged in various different types of training and coaching of managers about the risks of mental health issues and how they interface with those relevant pieces of legislation, and gone on to assist and create guides and documents that generate a process for how to deal with the management of mental health issues. But I just want to align with the message that Carlo and Lisa have put out today, is that an organisation that focuses only on mental health issues through the lens of risk mitigation actually may be more dangerous in a broader sense than approaching mental health issues in a more integrated way. So what I mean by that is if an organisation says, well, mental health issues are only dealt with when we pull out the industrial guide from the drawer and we go through a ticked process of how to deal with this mental health issue, though it may mitigate a industrial or legal risk, there's often situations where that approach causes much broader negative impacts. And just by way of a really simple example, we were drawn in to assist an organisation with an industrial relations interface. There was a lot of union involvement and we needed to advise around relatively aggressive union involvement. The genesis of that was performance management of an employee in a group that didn't have much union interface, and there was relatively amicable union interface. But when they started performance managing this employee, they became aware that there was an underlying mental health issue, and the organisation went straight to the legal, technical, medical intervention route, which drew the union in to be involved in an issue that, if it was managed more properly with a more detailed mental health engagement methodology, it wouldn't have got to an industrial interface, which caused a division in that work group. So the point being is that managers who are aware of the true rights, obligations, risks, and understand them, it takes the complexity away. There can be systems that can be generated behind the scenes that will assist in managing those risks, but that shouldn't be the single interface for managing mental health in the workplace.
Brilliant. So in terms of piecing together the intervention, like if I was to be thinking about where to go with my mental health literacy plan or approach, I'm hearing that leadership culture, is the fundamental target to start making it okay to speak about. And I'm hearing that sense proactive, on the educational standpoint, to be bringing information through, largely based on conversation, storytelling, experiences with bite-sized intel to tap into what we really need to know. I think the other piece that Connor did bring up too, just when we were speaking before the webinar started, was about active process as well. So it's about the learning, approach that the culture brings, where we're doing as much as we can proactively, that taps into the operational requirements that we can. When our managers, are struggling, with how to actually respond or work with an employee with mental health challenges, we respond, with the right advice, with the right coaching, advice to help them through. And then the other part is the reflective experience, where sometimes it doesn't go well. We have the courage to look at it, learn from it, and improve how we go into the future. And that sort of is walking the talk, I think, where Carlo mentioned authenticity as a critical piece, to that mental health literacy building strategy in a business. And we've started to move a little bit into like to and fro in terms of the how was tapping into the tactic, and the what was the, and what does it actually look like in practice, and so I think where Connor did lead into performance management, and this is probably one of the consistent areas that does come up for us. Perhaps it's biased from the type of business that we're in, is, and this is probably where we're looking for that sort of advice or the way of thinking that we start to give in leaders, and probably start with Lisa and then into Connor, where you'd sort of say, when you start to notice that shift or change? What is the advice that you're giving? You mentioned, have you asked them? But and it was, well, why would I? So it is tapping into that sense of where there's performance challenges and you're starting to hear leaders speak to mental health. What's the go-to advice, to sort of help take the next step and speak to it?
I think it is. I think it is tricky, right? It is. It's like you see performance that is dropped, and you see a difference in a person. Knowing your staff's really important, and if you see a decline, and just having the conversation is absolutely point number one. The challenge I have, and I'm keen to find out from Connor actually, is when a person says, so you go through, you do. For me, you still, even if a person has mental health challenges or going through a hard time, you talk about it, but they still need to perform. They still, but you give, you're compassionate and you support them and you work with them to get outcomes. And you said before, Connor, about you didn't have to go down that legal medical route, but when does a manager know, okay, I've done all the right things, I've supported the person, I've had the conversation, we've got, I've given them more time off, I've given flexibility, we've got outcomes documented that they're working towards, but they're still not performing. So when do we go down that route?
I think an overarching statement is that an organisation has a right to manage an employee's performance. And the mere existence or mere presence of a mental health issue doesn't unilaterally prevent an organisation from engaging in performance management of that employee. However, the organisation will need to be cognizant of relevant workplace laws and risks that exist when approaching management of an issue that you've explained, where there's been a drawn out intervention process. So if I just sort of reflect on some of the laws that I articulated before, under occupational health and safety legislation, where there is an underlying mental health condition known or potentially presumed, an organisation must not engage an employee in a course of action which will exacerbate that mental harm, because to do so would be a breach of their occupational health and safety duty. And this can be very difficult when seeking to take formal performance management or actions that may result in termination of employment, because objectively they are stressful things, just to reflect on Carlo's mention about stress in the workplace. Further, it's generally unlawful to terminate an employee's employment merely on the basis of some form of mental health diagnosis. So look, if you approach such circumstances of this that you've articulated, Lisa, it's advised that the organisation probably obtain relevant specialist legal, technical, industrial relations advice in addressing this issue at that juncture. And that advice may include a suggestion that the organisation have the employee's fitness for work assessed by a specialist physician like Carlo. I'm sure he's done many assessment like this. And that assessment will determine the employee's fitness to engage in difficult discussions, for example, discussions about performance, or their fitness to perform inherent duties of their role, if that's a live part of the issue. Following that assessment, the organisation then can consider the independent medical assessment and then make a decision about how it manages that issue moving forward, i.e. that the employee is fit to have a performance management process commenced and therefore undertake it, having mitigated the risk of exacerbating a mental health issue underlying. Now, it's my experience that it's actually relatively rare that an organisation that has an effective mental health management system, in line with sort of the things that we've discussed, Carlo and Lisa have discussed previously. It's my experience that if that sort of system is in place, it's relatively rare that an issue is escalated to the point of this industrial medico-legal juncture. because on one hand, managers who understand the relevant risks and have got an open engagement, as discussed, about mental health, which is led from the top, there's confidence and ability to manage mental health issues where they interact with performance, and that there's generally effective intervention prior to an escalation at the legal technical end. But at times, considering the reality of legal risks and industrial risk, an organisation may be required to undertake a technical medico-legal intervention that I've just explained. And this is where a lot of my work comes in this space at that advising level. Now, in these situations, after there has been a resolution, it's often, well, generally is my very strong advice after the matter's been finalised, that an organisation use the issue and the resolution as a learning experience, and to reflect on how and where the matter actually escalated and what future interventions could have been put in place to avoid the legal technical intervention. And I assume that would probably be a piece of advice that would be mirrored by Carlo and Lisa in situations that they've gone through that might have a similar interface.
Excellent. And I think you raised a really good point there in terms of that sense of it is rare for it to get to the medico-legal level, you know, and there can be a sense that we can over-plan for that to happen in most occasions, and it can become more likely the less we talk about it. And I was just interested, again, from a chief medical officer perspective, Carlo, where the impact of, I guess, lower productivity or performance, you know, and where there might be some pockets, you know, in a business, or some trends that you sort of start to notice where, okay, mental health is becoming an obstacle, you know, to productivity. How have you seen, you know, some proactive measures or steps taken to help, I guess, leaders feel more confident, you know, to address that?
So in my experience, a lot of the items we were talking about before about leadership and the CEO, the C-suite, managers becoming literate in mental health, it doesn't cost very much, but it's a modest investment to protect a lot of downside risk. Because what I've seen happen, and building on what Connor said, is like when it goes bad, it goes really bad. And what happens usually is you have it bubbling away for a while with a manager that doesn't feel equipped to deal with it, and quite often a HR function that also doesn't know how to deal with it. And the general way that we manage that issue is sort of like put our heads in the sand and hope that it improves. And then at some point, it often blows up. And in those situations, which I've seen not infrequently, and I agree with Connor about companies that have invested in a mental health management system, much less likely to have this occur. What happens in that situation? It affects productivity and performance, not just of the individual, but the manager, the team. The collateral damage is often very significant and can become quite toxic. And that becomes eroding of culture and trust. And there could have been these proactive steps that were actually implemented far sooner in that journey that would have totally prevented that toxicity, an industrial claim, a legal claim, and just a significant adversarial mindset. So the part that I think is important there is, as well as trying to build that literacy in the business, when you identify and sense that there's problems, because what this building the literacy often does is managers like, actually, you know, there's a bit of an issue bubbling along here, you can much more proactively deal with it. And if you don't have the skill set in-house to adequately deal with it, reach out to expert consultants that can come in and very, very quickly navigate this field to protect downside risk.
Brilliant. Brilliant advice. And I think where we sort of built on the advice around the mental health strategy is that sense of the intervention approach is desirably, you know, yes, responsive, you know, as items arise, to make sure that people affected have the right advice at that individual and manager level, you know. And then there's also that we're scanning the environment to see where things might have been hidden or avoided so much that they're not hitting that radar, and it might need a more targeted group intervention to really sort of acknowledge the toxicity, you know, and start to shift And so it is about trying to prevent that as much as possible, but stepping in where it's required. And we did have a question just to ask in there about if and so because we are sort of moving into the final 3 minutes, and keen to respect everybody's time, and if you did have any questions to throw them towards the panel. And one question just to add into the end here was, if the mental health issue has been documented and accepted by the organisation many years previously, does that become a protective safety net for the employee? Connor, yeah?
Yeah, well, I think, does it become a protective safety net for the employee? I would say no, there's no safety net for an employee per se. And an organisation that has been put on notice and is aware of a mental health diagnosis will have occupational health and safety duties to that individual to ensure that they're not exacerbated, but only to make variations or amendments where it's reasonable to do so. So it doesn't give the employee a definitive get out of jail free card around performance management or assessments as to whether that employee is fit to perform the inherent requirements of their role, given that they have a mental health diagnosis. But it's an interesting and complicated interplay because the employer has been informed of and is aware of a mental health diagnosis, and therefore will have duties to ensure that harm isn't exacerbated through the work that they're directed to do.
Gotcha. So I think that key message is that it shouldn't be. It could be, but there's no reason for it to be. It is something that we can lead proactively through. Okay. Thanks, team. I just thought with very quickly as we move towards a wrap up, Lisa.
Thanks. Just really quickly, I think what I wanted to emphasise is that we need to take a holistic approach here. So there's interventions. When you talk about interventions, you're talking about, I'm talking about organisationally now. There's 3 levels that you want to work at. Number 1 is to the individual and how they're managing their own mental health. So resilience programs, taking good care of their own health, etc. The second level is at the leadership of the team level, which is being able to create psychological safety within an organisation, and being able to have conversations. And thirdly, at the organisational level is making sure that you've got really accessible processes and procedures that that the culture supports having conversations around mental health. And the C-suite buy-in absolutely is critical because they need to invest in it and help with the visioning. So it's not just a one-off, let me give you a training program. It's a whole entwined process, but it can be done really well, and it makes a significant difference to the lives of the people and the productivity and financial impact for the business.
Brilliant. Yeah, great point. And I hope that the conversations today have helped navigate from that high strategic, get it on the radar level, right down to that individual level with some really clear examples for us all to be able to be more confident, I guess, in that proactive, reactive, reflective responses to mental health, challenges that might arise, and start to switch it from a mental health challenge. And just in terms of mental health is part of the health, that all of our people have. And we can be confident in making decisions to improve the wellness of our teams in the short, medium and long-term future. And a big shout out and thank you to Connor, Carlo and Lisa, for sharing your wisdom, advice and time today. And take care everyone out there, look after each other and see you again soon. Bye-bye.